This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to this week's episode, where my guest is writer, broadcaster, nature observer, citizen scientist and champion of the outdoors, Kelly Brenner. This episode came about off the back of a listener suggestion and begins with a look at Lycoris radiata, aka the death flower, and its place in nature and culture. This may seem an odd choice of subject for this festive time, but this is the last episode of 2023, and the nearest to the winter solstice, which heralds the death of the sun, so it somehow seemed fitting.
I am a writer, so I have 2 published books. I'm also a naturalist. Well, I guess first and foremost, I'm a naturalist. And I'm also a huge folklore nerd and an anime nerd. So all those bridges kind of came together to lead me to this particular flower.
Excellent. And what is the flower in question?
So it's a flower that has many names. It's the red spider lily, which is Lycoris radiata, but it's also known in Japan as the higanbana.
Okay, and so I'm assuming it's got quite a significant cultural background. Can you talk about that?
So it has association with death. And if you ever watch anime, you will see the Japanese spider lily come up time and time again because of its association with death. And there are many reasons for that. One of them is because it has traditionally been grown around graveyards in Japan. And the reason for that is that the bulb, particularly the bulb of the plant, is very poisonous. And in historic times in Japan, they would bury bodies. Of course, they didn't have coffins, so they would bury bodies in the soil. But there was a lot of pests that would dig up and disturb the bodies. So they began to plant this bulb of the flower around the tombs, around the graveyards, to prevent the bodies being disturbed. And so it became associated with graveyards and death. And because the flowers are red, a lot of people associated the flowers with blood and being drawn up from the bodies. And so it became known as the death flower, the corpse flower. And then it's a very tall, skinny flower, and it really waves a lot when it's breezy. So it became known also as the ghost flower. And that's one piece of it. There's another piece that goes to Buddhism. And that is that the flower blooms right around the time of Ohigan. In Japan is a Buddhist holiday to honor the dead, and people go visit their families' tombs and graveyards. And it's a period of time when they believe that the world of the living and the world of the dead kind of come together. And because it blooms at that time of the year, and especially around graveyards, it's associated with the world of the dead. And in Buddhism also, you have the Ohigan. You have a flower called they also call it the Manji Shugai. I'm trying to say it properly, which comes from a Buddhist scripture. And it's known as the heavenly flower. And it doesn't actually exist, but it's very similar to what the spider lily is. And so they would plant this around Buddhist temples. And so it also became associated with Buddhism. And there's Ohigan, which is the holiday, but there's also Higan. And Higan is from the Buddhist Heart Sutra. And Higan means the other shore. And what that refers to is the crossing of the mythical Sanzu River. And when your spirit crosses that river to reach enlightenment, it's symbolic as overcoming death. So the spider lilies are known to grow along the Sanzu River and greet all the newly departed spirits. So it has many layers of association with death throughout Japan.
And I'm guessing it's not something then people would cultivate in their gardens, is that right?
Well, you would think so, but in Japan, well, they grow it in graveyards, like I said. They also grow it along rice paddies and other agricultural areas intentionally, to keep away pests. And it has spread now. So it grows also in North America, mostly in the southeast part of the country where it's warmer. And people actually do plant it as a cultivar to grow in their gardens now. I'm not sure if everybody knows the association, if they just think it's a pretty flower, but it has spread now, and it actually has grown more in gardens around the world.
And are people becoming more aware of it, as you say, through anime?
Yes. This article I wrote on my website is I don't know, several years old now. And it's consistently the top viewed article on my website by a lot. There's 1,000+ people that view it every single month. And so I think as the popularity of anime grows, the awareness of this flower is starting to grow too, because it's very, very popular. And like I said, it's very common in anime and manga because it's a symbol of death. So if you see it, it often means that death is coming, or there's some underlying current of death in the story, or something very more blatant, where it's just somebody dying in a bed of the red spider lily flowers.
And what first drew your interest in it?
I think the anime reference, because I'm very curious about nature in whatever I read, whatever media it is, whether it's books or anime. And so I'm always paying attention to that nature. And especially if it has a folklore angle to it, it just is very fascinating to me. And of course, the association with death is always a very interesting angle to explore. So there's many layers of interest that attracted me to it.
So do you focus on folklore worldwide?
Yes, I'm very interested in folklore throughout the world. I'm hugely into fairy folklore in Ireland and Scotland. I'm very interested in the folklore of Japan and Korea. I kind of go around the world with my interests. So, and especially if it has a nature angle. So I'm always looking for something interesting and new to read about.
And what drew you to the folklore aspect of it particularly, do you think?
I like the folklore aspect of this flower in particular because it is so connected to the biology of the plant. So because it's poisonous and it can cause death if it's consumed, severe cases can cause death. And so whenever a piece of nature is used to explain things or to connect with things, I just find it really this is morbid to say beautiful, but that connection to nature is, I think, is something that we've lost in modern times. And so that older connection to nature and recognizing not just necessarily the symbology of it, but the biological piece of it, how the flower is deadly and how it's associated with death and used to deter animals from corpses. But also there's folklore about it. For example, if you pick it and bring it home, your house will burn down, which is likely a way to scare children to not pick the flowers and bring them home because they're toxic. So yeah, it's just there's so many layers, and it's so fascinating to see how people connected to nature, whether it was a flower or bird cry or whatever. I like that older connection. I think is something that we can bring back more in this modern world where we lose more of that connection.
While you were talking, I was thinking it's almost like you're kind of unpicking or moving backwards almost. And I don't want to assume that people in the past didn't have as much knowledge as us, but they did have different knowledge. And I think there's an element of making sense of the landscape and of nature through folklore. Is there the sense that you have to look backwards into these things to uncover the meaning that was there that maybe we've lost today?
I think so, yes. There's several layers of that. Like there's a medicinal way that we can look at these historic plants, because in China they did use the red spider lily medicinally, and now today we're finding that it helps, some of the chemicals in it help with Alzheimer's. So I think there's a lot of lost knowledge, or knowledge that we dismissed as primitive or silly, that was really erroneous to dismiss. And now we're finding more and more the things that ancient people, or not even that ancient, just past generations knew and we dismissed, are relevant, and not only relevant, but could be life-saving. The second point is that I think there's a lot that we can learn from what we know about nature today, because one of my favorite points are, for example, yew trees in the UK and how they're associated with churches. But we know now that the yews were planted before the churches were there. And because we know the folklore of the yew plant, or the yew tree, and the symbology of it to the Celts and the old, Druids and whatnot, we know that those plants were symbolic, really symbolic, so symbolic that the church had to come in and kind of usurp the symbol of it. And so the churches were built around the yew trees. It wasn't that the yew trees were planted because the churches wanted them there. The churches were trying to take over the symbology of the yew trees from the people they were trying to erase.
I think it's really valuable to look back and, as I say, try and unpick things from a different perspective, because, as you say, there's a lot that's been lost. And I also wondered how you bring wildlife into your wider work as well?
Most of my writing has to do with wildlife and plants. So I'm out a lot doing explorations and wandering around and just discovering nature. And the more I learn about nature, the more I learn about animals and whatnot, I really connect more back to the folklore piece of it again, and learning more about how people connected with nature and things that might have been considered dangerous to us now, and just the ways that they connected with them then. And today we're just so scared of everything. Like I said, the modern world is so disconnected from nature. And so we're scared of everything. They're talking about bringing grizzly bears back here to where I live in the North Cascades area in Washington State. And people are terrified of it. They're terrified of wolves. They're terrified of anything. But there's so much that's been lost, so much of that connection of historic times. And we can learn a lot, I think, from the way that the folk tales addressed animals versus how we look at them today.
Do you think we've completely stopped telling those kind of stories, or do you think we'll revive them at some point?
Yeah, I think a lot of it's been lost because in the modern world, we're really more focused on science. And I mean, I guess it's a long time coming from the time of the age of enlightenment, and dismissing magic and the occult and all the things that people used to believe. And so I think a lot of those stories have been lost, and we're telling stories differently. But I think if you look at places like, for example, children's books, I think a lot of those stories are still being told just in a different way into a different audience, maybe. And I think there's a lot of independent writers who aren't, doing the mainstream publishing, that I think are embracing those sorts of stories as well. So I don't think it's lost. I just think it's been kind of hidden and maybe overlooked for the more scientific and modern stories.
Do you think we'll maybe blend it a little bit in the kind of style of Robin Wall Kimmerer? So she comes at it obviously from a scientific background, but also weaves in the folklore. Do you think that's a possible way forward?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think a lot of people, well, like myself also, are interested in bringing back the folklore and the magical aspect of stories and nature, and that connection we have lost. But I think, yeah, I think it's definitely possible to reconnect it. And I think there's a few people out there doing it, and hopefully we'll hear more and they'll get bigger and more audiences. But yeah, you mentioned Robin Wall Kimmerer, who's definitely broke that boundary down and gained a more wide audience, which she's done because she's Indigenous. And so her voice is definitely more authentic and has that layer of history to it too.
I'm going to put you on spot now. Who else would you recommend that's actually telling stories these days?
One of my favorite writers who has written some stories like that is Sharon Blackie, who's British, and she's written a book of short stories, and they really do embrace that folklore, human interaction with nature, very much in the essence of Angela Carter and her The Bloody Chamber book. So that's one that I really liked the stories of.
Okay, so I've just Googled it. It's called Foxfire, Wolfskin, and Other Stories of Shape-Shifting Women. So yes, I haven't read that one, so I will definitely seek that one out. So you just kind of explore urban wildlife as well, and kind of offer like a very unique perspective. So obviously it's cold where I am. I'm assuming it's cold where you are, and possibly wet and a bit dingy. Are there ways that we can still connect with nature when it's the winter months? And in fact, do some things actually come alive during the colder months?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, we've had this is the second straight day of rain in Seattle, and my basement's all flooded. But I went out for a walk this morning. There's a little wetland behind my house. And because it's so wet and rainy and dark and dreary, but also really noisy with the rain, I encountered the coyote, which I've only seen a handful of times. And usually it's only the briefest of glimpse before it disappears because it knows that I'm there. But today it was running around the parking lot at the park. And because of the rain, it didn't hear me. And so I was able to watch it for, I don't know, a couple minutes as it was foraging around in the grass before it finally caught wind of me and ran away. So I think, to me, the winter and autumn months are more magical because there are fewer people out, and the wildlife has more free reign, I guess, almost like it was during lockdown during the pandemic, when the wildlife really had the run of the mill. And so I like this time of the year because, for one, it's darker earlier and later. And so things like owls are more active during times when I'm more active. And the weather, to me, like the foggy days and the really dreary, dark days, brings back my interest in folklore. It's like reduces the veil between the worlds. It's almost like you could see fairies coming out, you know? So I think that those times of the year are almost more magical to me, because I get more encounters that are more rare, like the coyote or the owls swooping around. So to me, it's my favorite time of the year to go out and explore nature.
Yeah, that's interesting, actually. I'm not in the same urban situation as you, I'm more rural, but I always thought actually that the animals came closer because maybe they were looking for food, it was scarcer. But yes, that's a very good point. We are not out and about so much. And I think where the landscape can be more bare, you can see things easier. You know, like lichen is there year round, albeit sometimes a bit dehydrated, but it's always there. And then when the branches are bare, all of a sudden there's this whole entire world of lichen that comes alive, and it's just a different world. So yeah, I really like the idea that things are slightly more magical, and it's just a shift in things. It's the shift in focus of attention. Can you also tell me about your Sleuthwood show as well? Because that's really interesting.
Right. So in my both my books, I wrote about historic naturalists. One of my favorite was Julia Mallister, who's British, and she was a slime mold expert. And today we just don't really have naturalists like that anymore that we know about. So my Sleuthwood show was an effort to introduce modern naturalists who don't have a science background. So they're not scientists, they don't have any formal education, or they have formal education, but maybe not in the science world. And there are people from all walks of life. Like I've had my tattoo artist, I just had an urban forester who runs a nonprofit. I've had authors and just all kinds of people who have this deep connection to nature and study different things. I had a guy who was doing a spider big ear. So he's basically trying to find all the different spider species he could in his state of Oregon. So all these people have a little interest or some sort of thing that they've nerded out over. And so I wanted to introduce the world to people who have that connection to nature, who have not lost it or who have regained it. A lot of them didn't have a childhood full of, running around in the wild, but they had some sort of connection, some event that happened to them as they were an adult that turned them onto the natural world. And now they've really connected with it in some unique way. And so the show is just an hour-long conversation with different people who have that interest, and it's very exciting to talk to different people about what they're interested in, what piece of nature they're connected to.
I think that is possibly it, that a lot of us have forgotten how to look and how to take the time to look. I mean, have you got any kind of tricks that can help people get back in touch with actually stopping and looking?
Yeah, I think to me, just being out there, and there's some different tricks that I tell people when I do talks. One of them is to slow down, because where I'm in the Pacific Northwest and people go on hikes all the time. It's like one of the pastimes here. And they go to a waterfall or they go to a point to look out over the view. But they're so intent on getting from point A to point B, they just zoom right by everything. And they miss the branches with the lichens. They miss the ferns growing on the rocks. They miss, the salamanders under the rocks or logs. And they miss half the stuff just to get to that viewpoint. And so I always tell people, slow down. I mean, if you go hiking with me, you're never going to reach the destination. And does it take an hour to go a mile, because I'm stopping to look at everything along the way. And the second thing is to go out during all the seasons we talked about earlier, going out not just in the summer months, but going out during different times of day and different seasons. The third one is to change your perspective. We always look for the megafauna, the deer or the squirrels or the big birds. But there's so much to see on like a little branch. You find windfall and the lichens and the mosses. And if you have a microscope, you can look in those things to find springtails and tardigrades and all kinds of little tiny organisms that you never knew you were walking by all this time. Oh, and my last tip is to use your senses. We go out and we look. We see the trees, we see the logs, we see the creek and the river and everything. But how often do you actually like touch it or smell it, or just sit down and just hang out with it for a while? So I think it's important that we use our senses. I say that where I live, there's not much that's poisonous or venomous. So I'm happily going around poking everything and smelling it. But of course, be careful wherever you are, because not everybody has that sort of landscape.
Yeah, no, quite. We're pretty safe here in the UK. But picking up on something that you said when you were talking about the people that you have on Sleuthwood, and that was that some don't have a kind of formal training or background in studying the disciplines that they're kind of writing about. And I think maybe previously there's been a kind of emphasis or a favouring of formal training, and perhaps the kind of magic is to be found in the people who are just observing and just telling stories but not coming at it from a scientific background. Do you think that might be the case?
Oh, absolutely. And I think people who are naturalists who find an obsession, they get really into it. Whereas in science, there's funding. And so you might be studying a spider for a year, but then your funding is going to change and you have to go off to do something else. But somebody like Julia Molister, who was a slime mold expert, she devoted like half of her life to slime molds because she could. There was no funding she had to worry about. She was just self-taught, and by the end she was the world's leading expert on slime molds. And so I think there's so much to be said for people who have no formal training, who just become obsessed with something and dive into it and just love it to bits and pieces. And a lot of those people have a secondary interest in arts or music or writing literature or whatever. And I think they bring that creative aspect to it, as we were talking about before, with the blending of folklore and science and nature. So I think people like that really offer a really unique perspective and an opportunity to bring what they learn and put it into music or put it into a poem or put it into a book or just share people, like at a pub. Who knows? You never know who you might run into that might be interested in whatever you're interested in.
I love that. That's just fantastic. It is that kind of melding of different disciplines that brings a different level and I suppose makes it more accessible as well to more people. If you had to recommend an episode for people to listen to, what would be your kind of gateway episode?
Oh, geez. So my first guest was an Indonesian artist. His name's Franz Anthony. And we've been friends for a long time, but we talked all about nature and his illustrations and how he's, inspired by nature in Indonesia. But we also talked about video games. So it was kind of a fun shift and blending of nature. And it just kind of illustrates how nature can really infiltrate all the different pieces of the world, even the modern world. Because we talked about Zelda and the new Tears of the Kingdom game, which we had both been playing obsessively, and talking about all the nature that we could find in Zelda and how you can just do bug photography in this video game and everything. So that was one of my favorite episodes because it was just a fun run through completely different topics of nature and how nature really infiltrates all those little different corners of the world.
Fantastic. And if people want to find out more about your work, where can they go?
So my website is metrofieldguide.com, and you can link to my Sleuthwood, my books, my writing. I've got tons of articles on my website. And also another project that I work on called Invertifest, which is something that Franz and I have been working on. And every few months, so there's going to be a new one at the end of December, the last 7 days. And basically all we want people to do are go find invertebrates, write about them, research them, post your art, music, whatever, on social media with the hashtag Invertifest. Basically, we just want to spam the internet with invertebrates because invertebrates get overlooked, and we want to make sure everybody thinks how cool they are, knows that.
Thank you very much to Kelly for speaking with me, to Beatrice for suggesting the episode topic, and to you for listening. If you're interested, I can be heard on Friday's episode of Sally Flatman's Our Plant Stories podcast, where I can be heard speaking about my favourite clip of Roots and All from 2023. At 1,000,000 miles an hour. Why didn't you all tell me I'm a bit frantic? Roots and All will be back in mid-January. Thank you for listening this year, for supporting me via GoFundMe and Patreon, to those of you who've reviewed the podcast and shared the episodes, and followed me on social media. All of these things help get the podcast out there, and if you haven't done so yet, please could you leave the podcast a review wherever you listen to podcasts. It's a very small thing, but it will really help get the episodes in front of a wider audience, and will help me share the brilliant content and knowledge that my guests generously share week in, week out. Now here's Dr. Ian Bedford's final bug of the week for 2023. I hope you have a lovely Christmas and a happy New Year.
Every year, from November through to March, our gardens go through their seasonal period of rest, leaving just the cold-loving plants to keep us enthused during this latent period for the natural world. and these plants will be happily growing in an environment where there's little chance of them being damaged by the leaf-munching and the sap-sucking bugs, who should all be dormant and hidden away from the lethal effects of freezing weather until the spring. But as winter progresses, though, the effectiveness of these hideaways will often be tested, and for many, the bugs within will become exposed to sub-zero temperatures and perish. But knowing that the dormant bugs can easily die if not protected from the winter weather is actually very useful for gardeners, especially those who have recurring problems each year with pests on their fruits and vegetables, since it means that during the winter months, when those pests are in their dormant state, something can be done to reduce their numbers in advance of the next season's crops. And it's relatively simple to do once you know a little bit about their life cycle and where the various pests will likely be overwintering. For common foliar pests, such as flea beetles, slugs, snails, sawfly and weevils, they'll be tucked away as eggs, larvae, pupae or adults, under pots and containers, or amongst the fallen leaves and garden debris, whilst the dormant stages of whitefly and aphids will likely be attached to the outer leaves of winter vegetables and hardy weeds. So by having a thorough clear-up during winter, removing the plant debris and other potential hideaways, many of these pests can be exposed to the frosts or removed by hand. And in addition, the overwintering stages of ground-dwelling pests such as root fly, wireworms, cutworm, and those small black garden slugs can be dealt with by removing all the old infested roots and tubers, and by regular hoeing and raking of the growing areas, which again will expose these pests to the frosts and the hungry insectivorous birds.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.